Hello and welcome to Chopper's Brexit Podcast. I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent. This week, we're not in the Red Lion pub, we're in the studio just off the newsroom at the Telegraph offices to try and work out what's going on in the mad world of Brexit. Well, right now, MPs are back, sitting in the House of Commons, have been ordered to come back by the Supreme Court and the Speaker of the House of Commons, because judges ruled yesterday that the Parliament should not have been prorogued by Boris Johnson. And of course, the PM has flown in to face the music from the UN conference in New York. Well, with me right now, I've got Owen, Bennett, our Whitehall Editor, and Camilla Tominey, our Associate Editor, to try and help us unpack what on earth is going on in the mad world of Brexit. I hope you enjoyed the podcast.
Hello, Chopper.
Hello, Chops. How you doing?
How are you doing?
Can I call you Chops?
You can call me Chops.
Good.
Let's go straight in. Camilla, you were there on Monday. Was it Tuesday?
What day are we on?
It was Tuesday.
It's been a busy week, guys, hasn't
You were
it?
there.
It's been a busy
You
week.
were there at Tuesday at the ruling in the Supreme Court. What was it like? Were there gasps?
There were gasps. It was extraordinary, really. Obviously, a number of media has covered it, but lots of people were up at the Labour Party conference still in Brighton. So I headed down there at 9:30. I got a little blue ticket. I got my seat, and we waited, and the doors of the court closed, and Lady Hale, dressed in her black outfit with her slightly ominous spider brooch.
Cool. I mean, that moved towards the neck during the actual briefing.
Oh
I thought
my
that was moving up and down.
It's a bit scary. And to coin a cliche, as the hearing went on, it seemed that Boris Johnson was going to get increasingly tangled in the legal web that was being spun in the Supreme Court.
Yes.
And it was funny because journalists beforehand, who had been covering it far more closely than I had, were sort of saying, yeah, I think Boris is going to win this one. And as the judgment went on, the summary, the more I was expecting her to say, but, and it just never came. So it was like, this hasn't been right, and this hasn't been right, and what we've all concluded, and then, of course, the killer line that the prorogation was unlawful. And when she came out with that, there was an audible,
Well, yes.
and there was, and then the court kind of like looked at each other, because I don't even think Gina Miller, who was sitting a few feet from me, had expected it to be that conclusive. I mean, it wasn't just a bad day for the government, it was the worst outcome possible. And she was there, she was stunned actually after the judgment was made, because she was kind of being patted on the back by a lawyer. It wasn't jubilant scenes or anything like that. It was like muted applause. And then as everyone left the courtroom and started going outside and people were cheering Gina, Gina, Gina for PM and such like, then the calls came for Johnson's resignation. And people started chanting Johnson out, Johnson out.
So we're, of course, in the Labour Party conference, Owen, Bennett, and I was watching it in a big room with the TV turned up to full volume with Keir Starmer just there watching it. And the place, auction was sucked out the room. Went, I can only liken it to when I was in the room for Boris Johnson saying he wouldn't stand for leadership in 2016. That kind of moment of, wow, no one saw that. I mean, of course, it could have come, and in hindsight, maybe it looks obvious, but at the time, no one thought it was coming. I mean, Owen, how do you take the result?
I was at a fringe that Emily Thornberry was speaking at, and obviously the fringe kicked off about 10:15, and we knew the judgment was coming at 10:30. So the interview with Thornberry was going on stage, but everyone was just frantically refreshing their Twitter feeds and shouting it out. And actually, the microphone, they stopped the interview and passed the microphone to someone in the audience who'd got hold of the judgment. So it was learning about it sort of in real time. And then within 30 seconds of the judgment, I had a text from our political editor Gordon Rayner saying, "Go back to London."
What did Emily Thornberry say when it came through?
Emily Thornberry, I mean, she tried to sort of couch it, and she didn't try to say anything too much straight away. So obviously, she didn't know what the party line was, and she hadn't seen the judgment.
Yes.
And she's more sensible as a politician to sort of say Boris should go straight away. But there was a sense of at that moment that the game had changed. That what we had been discussing at conference, the big row at conference. Discuss later maybe, was Tom Watson and that kind of thing. And then it was like, no, this has all changed now. This conference is no longer the most important place to be in British politics.
Extraordinary time, isn't it? I mean, and they really wound up the conference. We should be there now, shouldn't we? Getting ready for we're recording this on
speech, yes.
on Wednesday lunchtime.
Having said that, what was also interesting about the timing is that it had been made clear in the Supreme Court that neither of the legal teams had been given the judgment in advance. So what was implicit in that was neither had number 10. So we then had the spectacle of Boris Johnson at 4:30 a.m. New York time watching this live stream in his own hotel. The idea that he got the news when the rest of us did is kind of quite stunning, isn't it? And equally, when you say there was some restraint from Emily Thornberry, what struck me was the speed with which Joanna Cherry, who had brought the Scottish case, the SNP MP, and Ian Blackford, who had been in the courtroom as well, called for Boris Johnson's resignation. I literally saw Blackford on the stairs leading out of the court. He was like, well, Johnson must go. MPs need to go back to work immediately. And of course, it wasn't just that kind of paradigm shift from a legal and constitutional perspective, but politically, this was the new mission.
And geographically,
to get
it moved
Johnson
right
out.
back to Westminster for all the news.
Exactly.
But he's Blackford's right, isn't he, Owen? Boris Johnson should be resigning today.
Well, I think if it was the leader, the chief executive, the boss of any other company who had been found to have acted unlawfully in this way.
In advice to the Queen.
In advice to the Queen. I mean, it is unbelievable to think that he's still there. Now, it wasn't just Boris Johnson, of course. It was Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was the one that went up to Balmoral as the chair of the Privy Council.
Correct,
to give
President of the Council.
Sorry, President of the Council to advise the Queen to prorogue Parliament. Questions about him as well. This
Jeffrey Cox,
Jeffrey Cox, the Attorney General. I mean, I feel that when it came out, it was leaked that Jeffrey Cox had given the legal advice that this was legal. Well, I mean, you'd expect that because they went ahead and did it. It would be more of a story if he'd have said this wasn't legal and he'd gone and done it. I think Jeffrey Cox, a lot of the lawyers in Parliament are saying that actually his advice was based on precedent, so his advice perhaps wasn't as bad as it now looks.
But also we have to remember that Jeffrey Cox's advice mirrored that of the High Court.
Yes.
It mirrored High Court judges, esteemed justices, who concurred with the government's decision that it was lawful to prorogue. So what we've seen here, and it's been interesting because the Queen has been dragged in, and has she been lied to, or has she been unconstitutional in her own behaviour? And somebody pointed out to me at the Palace yesterday, this is a woman who has reigned for 67 years. Yeah. She has seen 14
Someone told
prime
me, Camilla,
ministers.
she finds most things hilarious. Is that right?
Well, she finds quite a lot of things hilarious.
She's
and
seen
she's a great
everything.
mimic. So she's seen it all. But actually, she hadn't seen this. This has been an unprecedented move for the Supreme Court to coin a phrase, take back control,
Right.
and reassert
But we've seen this
parliamentary
before.
sovereignty.
So we saw Burko, didn't we, in January, rewriting precedent. He said famously, well, if we always abide by precedent, nothing will ever change. And
Yes.
yesterday we saw the Supreme Court doing their bit in a kind of Burko-esque way of rewriting the rule book, didn't we?
Well, and I think, funnily enough, people in the royal household are quite grateful for that because it has constitutionally been an absolute nightmare to navigate some of these unwritten rules. And we did a poll yesterday in the Telegraph which suggested that half the public would like to see a written constitution as we have in America. Do we then get into the situation where we have politically elected Supreme Court judges?
Just now in House of Commons, we just come from there, Jeffrey Cox said he thinks that Parliament will have oversight on future appointments of judges, which could be quite interesting, couldn't it, Owen?
Yes, I mean, we've seen, it's often forgotten, but they've tried to politicise justice in this country already with police and crime commissioners, where they tried to get people who are responsible for crime in your area, and they tried to introduce a democratic element into that. Hasn't really taken off with the public.
Yeah.
But that was very much the beginning, I thought, the thin end of the wedge of what would lead up to elected judges, yeah.
Were you surprised by the coverage today? It was the papers, including the Telegraph, held back. We have seen enemies of the people headlines in the past. There were calls yesterday from in the cabinet read out last night. Robert Buckland, the Lord Chancellor, saying lay off the judges. But no one's put any pressure on them, are they? The government has accepted the ruling and has said no, it won't.
What can the government do? I mean, we had Ambrose Evans-Pritchard writing very eloquently, as usual, for us today, saying actually, when you look in the face of kind of gilets jaunes protests and people completely losing it in other countries, the fact that the law has taken charge of this situation and issued a direction and the government has accepted it proves that we are a democratic nation, much as it's criticised for being a banana republic. But the point is for this, I think you have to look at Cox's words in the chamber this morning. He's saying that we are able to criticise a judgment without criticising the motives of the judges, and that's significant. And that is where Rees-Mogg's comment about it being a constitutional coup has courted some controversy. But moreover,
that was
of course,
in the cabinet call last night.
Yes, but moreover, I think what's the number 10 reaction to this? This is going to be a question of what the public think. And I spoke to a few figures yesterday and indeed another this morning who are saying this is playing into our hands as far as the public is concerned, because the public just sees the elite trying to grab more and more and more control over what they see as their democratic mandate, that 17.4 million figure, continues to be heralded as the democracy that should be upheld, that leave vote. So from a government's perspective, I think they're quite happy at the moment. I know it's been catastrophic, and in the Westminster bubble, everyone's losing their heads. But for Boris at the moment to be seen as the ultimate Brexit martyr, it certainly puts him up against... It knocks Farage into a cocked hat in that respect. You know, Boris is the one trying to save Brexit. Nobody's really talking about the Brexit Party, which is convenient because the Tories don't want to enter into a pact with them.
Yep. Owen?
No, I think Camilla's completely right that you know it's very lazy political journalists to go outside the bubble. People think as if we've got some great insight into that. But I think it's true to say that most people will look at this and see Brexit still being frustrated, and Boris has said, look, I want this done by October 31st, come hell or high water, do or die, dead in the ditch, all that kind of stuff. And I think you're right, they don't then need to amp up any attacks on judges. They can say, look, you just see it as what it is, you make your mind up, but we think you know where we are. So I think I think it's been good that they've dialed that rhetoric a little bit.
And also, let's just analyse that polling very briefly. So 51% of the public said that they agreed with the Supreme Court decision, but then 60%, nearly two-thirds, said we want Brexit to be delivered on the 31st of October, and that figure included a third of Remain voters.
Okay.
So every poll we see seems to suggest that Brits want Brexit to be delivered.
What would you be advising Boris Johnson to do next?
Well, I think we had a slight hint of it when Geoffrey Cox, the Attorney General, appeared in the Commons when the Commons was recalled, and he said, we need a general election. This is a dead parliament, he kept saying. And he said one of the fears that people who are opposed to general election have is that they would allow a general election, they'd vote for one, but then Boris would move the date after October 31st, and thus we would leave with no deal. He was saying, Geoffrey Cox, put forward a one-line bill setting the date of the general election into law so that you can make sure the general election takes place before October the 31st. So we should have a very, very snap election. Now, without wishing to get too bogged down in the Fixed-Term Parliaments Act, which must be one of the worst pieces of legislation ever introduced into this country, that decries that if Boris Johnson, if two-thirds of MPs vote for a general election, you have to have 25 working days before that vote. If Boris Johnson loses a vote of no confidence, then you have 14 days to try and form another government, and then you have 25 days before a general election can be held. If they can introduce a bill which gets rid of all of that and says we can have a general election in the next 2 weeks, next 3 weeks...
There is time. It's not 14 working days under the FTP.
No, it's not.
It's just days.
It's just days.
But it's 25 working days.
But you can introduce a one-line bill now which overrides the Fixed-Term Parliament Act, which guarantees that general election before October the 31st. Now, that would be great for Boris Johnson because he could go to the country and say, look, this is basically your chance to get Brexit done. Everyone else wants to extend it. The Brexit Party, they're just going to weaken us, vote for us, give me the mandate that we need for October the 31st, then we can get in and we can repeal the Ben bill.
But Camilla, why would Labour want to help Boris Johnson get his election? Because he benefits from an election and Labour doesn't it?
Also, I think Labour are worried about the numbers, and we've seen in recent polling that the Lib Dems' revocation strategy has stolen across some Remain voters from Labour. And also, why wouldn't the opposition parties want to have an election further on into November, perhaps if no deal has happened, even though they're trying to prevent it and the Ben bill suggests that it can't legally happen, but just assume it does. What they would want is a general election in the middle of some kind of cliff edge, no parachutes calamity where the government's in complete and utter chaos. If that actually happens. The whole thing's a gamble, but it's quite a shrewd move by the government to try and press this issue with the one-line bill because it really gets Corbyn, it sees the whites of Corbyn's eyes. Are you afraid? Are you afraid you're not going to win this? And actually, even the optics around a Labour leader that doesn't want an election are terrible.
Even Turkey's vote for Christmas,
exactly. I mean, Cox
said today.
Cox was very mild-mannered and then completely lost it on this point and was having a right go at the opposition benches. But I think a lot of the general public will agree with that. It doesn't seem particularly democratic from either of the opposition parties to block a public vote on this.
So that's how you get an election before Brexit Day. But how do you get Brexit, Owen Bennett?
Well, if you get Brexit, if
October 31st, I mean.
If you don't have the election, then I think it's very difficult to get Brexit by October the 31st because I think the Ben Act, which requires the Prime Minister to ask for an extension if no deal is secured by October the 19th, the Hillary Benn Act.
Passed against the government's wishes.
Yeah, that is there in law now, and Geoffrey Cox said today the government is going to uphold the law. So I think that Boris Johnson is desperate to get something. There is another way out of all of this, which no one really talks about anymore, which is we could actually get a deal.
Yes.
Right? We could actually get a deal. Now, I was talking to people involved in the Alternative Arrangements Commission, which is the kind of...
Nicky Morgan, Greg
Hands.
Hands.
Nicky Morgan, no more, she's in government, but yeah, it's Greg
Greg
Hands,
Hands.
Suella Braverman, people like Stephen Kinnock. And they were in Germany earlier this week talking to German MPs to try and set out their alternative arrangements to feed back up to Angela Merkel.
Fascinating.
They were giving a technical briefing to MEPs there in Brussels to try and say, look, there is a deal there we believe that can be done, and if we can feed this into you guys in Europe now, then come that European Council, you can meet us halfway.
Were they there with the blessing of Number 10? Because Boris Johnson talked about this report, didn't he? Both with Merkel and with Macron.
I'm not sure if Number 10 were explicitly given the blessing, but Shankar Sangam, who is a economist who has been very key in trying to get this alternative arrangements plan off the ground. We know that he's very close to Number 10. He's close to people in Number 10. So this is the kind of thing that would definitely be going with their blessing. I don't think there's any way this commission would be going out there and saying we could do X, Y, Z if X, Y, Z hadn't already been cleared.
And those arrangements like cameras away from the border, checks at ports, and an agri backstop for all of Ireland.
Yes, they even talk about things like using satellites to scan barcodes. You know, it's using all this kind of technology. It's getting sort of,
It's untried though, isn't it?
I mean, it's untried, it's untested, it's unreliable.
It's untried, but it would require a rollout. And I suppose we have to keep on making the distinction here between what the withdrawal agreement represents, which is a staging post, and what might be in the political declaration. If the EU have been more willing to change the political declaration, which was anathema to Brexiteers because it doubled down on the backstop, change the language of that. There's talk about this all-Ireland backstop, although Peter Foster, our colleague, talks about the EU not wanting to, quote, slice and dice. But is that some sort of a solution? What's interesting here is that the one thing the Remainer rebels in the Tory party have miscalculated, particularly Amber Rudd, was this notion that Boris Johnson doesn't want a deal. Boris Johnson, in my mind, does want a deal for two main reasons. First of all, he doesn't want to be at the dispatch box for the next 3, 6, 9 months, fighting off brickbats about how disastrous no deal has potentially been and that he has been accused of a failure of statescraft. Point 2, he wants to be the politician that has delivered Brexit for the people. That is going to be his political legacy. So this idea of these hysterical MPs going around saying he's got, he doesn't want no deal. And what's even more ironic and puts the spotlight on the likes of Philip Hammond and co is, if they're going to rebel against the idea of no deal, in order to prove that they do really want Brexit to happen, why aren't people like Hammond and the Gawkwood squad joining the cross-party alliance with Stephen Kinnock, Caroline Flint and other Tory MPs for a deal? All of these MPs now...
Sitting today with the Tories, by the way, in the House.
Yeah, well, great. Of course they should be. You cannot be a rebel Tory who has rallied against no deal and not support a deal, can you? So the calculation now is how many Labour MPs can the government convince to vote
25,
for a deal?
30? Owen, do you know?
Well, Caroline Flint says it's up to 50. A lot of people think that's quite an optimistic
Was that a recent number? Or
that was something she said a couple of weeks ago, about a week ago. So people think that's quite optimistic. But there are lots of people. The Labour MPs have got to really look at this and say, look, we've spent 3 years saying that no deal is absolutely terrible. And if there's a position when they can stop no deal, which is voting for a deal, and they don't take that, how are they going to tell that to their constituents?
How damaged is Labour? I mean, we spent Monday, didn't we, in Brighton? We were all there in Brighton. When it was just chaos, wasn't it, in the hall? And what is the Labour policy? Do you want to explain it to the listener briefly, Camilla?
Well, the Labour policy appears to be, and Michael Gove was on the airwaves this morning offering, I think, LBC listeners a fiver if they could explain the Labour policy on Brexit. So let me try and explain. Basically, Corbyn's position in the face of a Remain movement among the membership to have the party fully embrace Remain, his position, because, whisper it, he's a Eurosceptic, is that the Labour Party go into a general election saying that they will offer a second referendum, but if they win that general election, they will go to Brussels and negotiate a deal. But once they've got that deal, their policy will be to support Remain against that deal when it comes to championing a second referendum campaign, which doesn't make any logical sense. Emily Thornberry was caught out about this in Question Time a couple of weeks ago, the BBC show. So that's difficult. But Labour's dilemma is exactly the same as the Tories. They cannot be alienating Labour voters in Leave constituencies. These are the very voters who are supporting Nigel Farage, and there's a tug of war over them. Will they be persuaded to go to the Tories? This is the question. Will these, people who traditionally would have voted for a donkey if it had a res rosette on, but are so annoyed about Labour's failure to embrace Brexit properly, will they switch to the Tories?
Won't Farage benefit? Farage Brexit Party, 14% in the polls or so?
It depends when the general election is. If the general election is before October the 31st. Maybe not, because Boris might still claim, you need me to deliver Brexit. If it's after October the 31st and we haven't left, then I think Farage could then benefit.
Do you think any sense that Boris Johnson should go all in for a no deal, neutralise the Brexit Party down to 5% of the polls, get 40% of the vote, get 40 seats, 80 seats, whatever recent polling is saying, and then win a majority of it, and then tack back into the middle ground over the next 5 years? He's quite a soft left Tory, isn't he, basically?
That could happen if the economic fallout of no deal isn't quite as catastrophic as those on the Remain.
Over a 5-year piece, it could be.
I know, but then there could be a number of challenges to his leadership from within, and it also depends on a majority he wins on the back of that mandate. But by the way, I would say, ironically, and one wonders why more Remainers don't support no deal. No deal annihilates Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage's political career is over.
That's why he does it. That's why Boris should do it.
Brexit Party don't get 5%. They get no percent.
Okay, but that's why Boris should do it.
Well, that is one motivation that Boris should do it. But at what cost? And at the risk of completely alienating not just Remainers, but also because Brexit has become this, in my mind, wrongly become this right-wing construct. He's then accused of sort of not being the politician he wants to be. He's accused of being, quotes, rabid right-winger when he wants to be the most liberal Conservative Prime Minister in history.
But, Owen Bennett, aren't we seeing the two main parties aligning around the vote from 2016 eventually? We're nearly there, aren't we? That the Tories are now the Leave Party, Labour eventually will become the Remain Party, and then that's that.
I think that is pretty much how people now think of themselves in politics. Are they a Remainer or are they a Leaver? And there's so much now associated with those terms. If you're a Remainer, you're seen as a certain way. If you're a Leaver, you're seen as something else. And I think it's going to be very difficult.
Well, racist, you're about to say, weren't you?
Well, yeah, if you're a Leaver, you're seen as someone who's extremely patriotic. You're seen as someone who believes that Britain could be doing better.
Backward looking.
Yeah, that's
all the things which I would challenge, actually, but that's what...
Of course, and if you're a Remainer, you're seen as someone who's perhaps slightly more educated and someone who's got a slightly more broad view of the world, or someone who doesn't really understand the choices that face real people in their lives. So I think that's where the split is now, and I think that people are going to identify as that for a long time. Unless actually we get a deal... And actually, people then don't really notice that much difference to their daily lives.
No, but this is the interesting thing. If we get a deal, will Farage and the Brexit Party continue to campaign after the perception is that we've Brexited, because we have? Will he start campaigning for a more Brexity Brexit? And how much will that pick off the Tory vote after the 31st of October? Point one. Point two, as a personality, does Boris Johnson now have the ability to transcend his own party? Is he the kind of figure who represents...
A Trump figure?
Well, a Trump figure that transcends the Tory party and represents himself as, quotes, the people's prime minister. Because I wouldn't say this of any other Tory, but he does have that stardust effect with the general public. Could you have Labour voters saying in the cafes of Northern Leave constituencies, do you know what, I think I'm going to vote for Boris Johnson? And the person next to them say, well, hang on, you can't vote for him because he's a Tory. And they retort with, no, he's not, he's a Brexiteer. Could people see Boris as somebody who could unite that, as we've seen in recent days, that sort of politically homeless, left behind, we haven't been listened to, our vote doesn't count electorate?
I'm going to ask you both some sharp questions now. Do you mind?
Right. Do we need one-word answers?
Yes,
Unlike politicians,
we do.
we can do that, can't we, Owen?
Owen Bennett, are we leaving on October 31st?
No.
Camilla?
Yes.
Owen
Really?
I'm just saying that because I like saying the opposite of you, as you know,
Fair enough,
Owen. Yeah.
fair enough.
You do mean it, Camilla.
I think we are going to leave, yeah.
Thank you. Owen Bennett, will Boris Johnson be PM at Christmas?
Yes.
Camilla?
Yes.
Hold on, no. What was my first answer? I don't think there's going to be Brexit. No, I'm changing it. I've got two
Yeah,
joint
if you think
answers.
there's going to be delay, you're saying that he's probably out.
Yeah,
then.
he's out. He's out.
What
He's
are we
out.
left with? What somebody described to me as I love this phrase, a rhubarb and custard coalition of Labour and the Liberal Democrats.
I
I like that.
Yeah.
Oh, I like rhubarb custard.
Yes, feel free to steal that in future coffee
or a
shop.
fruit salad, and there's sweets.
Yes.
How on earth do we heal this country? We're journalists, we like the conflict, but how on earth do politicians heal this country?
Do you know what? I
Camilla.
don't like this language about division, right? We've always
it
been
exists.
divided. Hang on a minute. We've always been divided in this country, left and right, pro-Europe, anti.
Like this, though?
Milk in first, milk in last, right? That is
Scone,
what life
jam,
is all about.
jam and cream.
Scone or scone, let's
Yeah.
be honest.
Jam
right?
or cream first?
Exactly, right?
Unclear.
And actually, when you get away from the hysteria of this place, I don't know about anyone else here, but I've had the most meaningful and interesting discussions with people that I don't agree with politically that I've ever had in my life, with the mums at school, with people at work, with the girls I play football with. And it's all very cordial. Thankfully, it's not like the situation in France or other countries where people are literally at each other's throats. I know it's been difficult, but on an immediate level, I don't see the division. I see that we are rising to a challenge here, and we're trying to get through what has been a quite extraordinary situation.
Are you saying that all this might be a good thing? That in fact it's re-engaged people with democracy?
Yes.
In a good way?
It's made people care. It's my children are talking about this. My children are engaged in the political process. Younger people wanting to have a say. We had a situation for about a decade post-Blairism where no one cared.
Yeah.
They're all the same. And now you can't go past a bus stop or into a pub without overhearing a conversation about current
Fair
affairs.
enough. Owen, Bennett, is it all good for us?
I think it's certainly true that many people have now become more engaged. You know, friends of mine who never really took an interest in politics are now talking about it without even realising they're talking about politics a lot of the time. You know, the amount of texts I get from people saying, "Oh, what's this about?"
They blame you, though, at the Telegraph.
They blame. Well, I'm a new joiner, so I'm all right. My hands are clean about anything that goes
Yeah, it's only a matter of time.
Yeah,
we'll dirt them soon.
Get dipped in what's
But do
going
they
on.
blame you, or do they say they want to know what they want to know? They think you know what's going on, don't they?
Yeah, the fools. But I think it's a good thing. I think, look, there is an appetite in this country now, I think, for people to talk about big issues beside Brexit: housing, social care, education, law and order, which there hasn't been for a long time, because there was a kind of post-1997 consensus around actually a lot of things. You know, Blairism was so total. I mean, look at David Cameron. He was a school, you know,
He called him the master.
He called him the master, him and Goldman that together. So there was a kind of totality of thought there, which meant that a lot of issues pushed forward for the better. Things like gay marriage, that was a conclusion of that. But other things...
Boring old consensus, wasn't it?
But other things were ignored, and no one was talking about them. One of them was concerns over immigration. So I think we're finally going to have those debates we haven't had for a while. And there's a very, very receptive audience out there.
Owen, Bennett, Camilla Tominey, thank you for coming on Chopper's Brexit Podcast, a special edition recorded in the heat of this crisis. And to you, wherever you are, thank you for listening. Only 10 days to go until Podcast Live on Saturday the 5th of October, when you can see me record a live episode with the chairman of the ERG group of Tory MPs, Steve Baker. Go to podcastlive.com now for tickets and use the code CHOPPER10, all in capitals, to get 10% off. Yes, 10% off, Owen. Thank you to Theo Louloudis and Elliot Lampitt who produced this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please do go and leave us a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you to Travelling West for writing that you get a, quotes, thrill when you see the notification that a new episode has arrived, close quotes, and you, quotes, save it up like a treat. Do you save this up like a treat?
Do you know what, Chopper?
You do, don't
I just
you,
can't
Camilla?
Get enough of you, as you know, right? We work in the office together, we podcast together, sometimes we even socialise together,
it's
don't
like
we,
we're
Owen?
family.
No, absolutely
it's
not.
Like one big happy Telegraph family.
I know, and no rows.
Never.
If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Brexit Broadcast or email us, choppersbrexitpodcast@telegraph.co.uk. But always buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. Until next time, cheerio!
Bye.
Great. Thank you.
Very good.
Very good.
Great fun, you guys. Owen Jones. It says here, Owen Jones.
Oh my God, that was me. I'm sorry.
It says here, Owen Jones. Can you edit? I'm going to carry on now, okay.